All right, welcome to the module called Age of Faith. This is going to encompass a lot of chapters. It's going to be very heavy in content. We're going to talk about three main religions in this, which is Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. But we will talk about Buddhism, Hinduism, Jainism in Asia. Um, I'm only talking about these in their relationship to how art and societies sort of were rising and falling and such. So I know that sometimes mentioning religion can be kind of a touchy subject, but that's the perspective that I'm viewing these right now, and just sort of talking about what was going on with them and not to focus on any one in particular. That being said, this is a very long unit, so this is another one where I'm going to try to go quick and hit the main points. And as listed here, I want us to understand how Christian churches came about, what was the influence of Islam in the world, and how we are moving from really a polytheistic societies to monotheistic based societies. So poly meaning many, mono being one, right? And theism, the belief. So the belief in one God or many gods. In all the societies that we've looked at before, there's this focus on many gods and many roles. And so now we have Judaism, Christianity, and Islam that focus on one God and have sort of a very specific practice with each of those. Jewish art has been around for a long, long time, and we see a lot of it and their depictions being about the Torah, which is the Jewish text, and in these usually a lot of images decorate the synagogues, these places of worship that there would have been. So here's some earlier forms of those sort of styles, and I'm not going to necessarily stay on one too long, but we see the iconography start to develop in Jewish art that becomes also a part of Christianity. So we have, the candles here. We even have the Ark of the Covenant, and these are the earliest images found in catacombs under Rome. So these are actually for Christianity, but we're using that Jewish iconography. Mosaics are a common form that we're going to talk. We've mentioned before, but I'll use the term tesserae, which just remind you are these tiles. There are pebble mosaics, and then there are tile mosaics, and tesserae refer to the tile mosaics, and the others are pebble mosaics. So this kind of gives you an example. You can see how they're breaking these tiles and cutting these tiles down into the size they want, and of course laying them down. And you'd use a grout to sort of seal them, or sometimes wet concrete. There's a lot of different ways, but these are going to be a lot. We're going to talk about mosaics a lot in this unit. Now, the architecture I've already mentioned before towards the end of the Rome module. Here's the terms that you need to know for those. And these churches started as Roman basilicas, and it really wasn't till much later that we really start to see them as the places that become the Gothic style cathedrals and these places of massive pilgrimages and stuff like that. But churches were built and for a long time have housed relics that were always associated with martyrs and saints and these considered like holy objects. So these buildings became more and more important to the Christians as the religion grew. So here's a basic um, introductory style that is based off of Roman basilicas. We'd seen sort of a cutout before. So we have the nave, or that center aisle that you'd walk down, the transepts, which is sort of the cross sort of shape at the top. And then the altar, when I'll jump to this aerial view here, right, would be in the back. And if being here in Helen, if you've ever gone to the cathedral, you can almost imagine that same setup, right? The aisles themselves, of course, are on the side, more for common people, and then we had this opening, sort of gathering place in the beginning. So all of this, though, was just appropriated from Roman basilicas. They don't have the time or money when Christianity is first starting. It is not about like, oh, we're just going to build a ton of churches. So they're just using what they have. As time goes on, yes, these start being built as people are being converted, as patrons are being developed, as people are now their money there's money that's coming in, right? More organizations coming about it. So we see uh, this style become very specific to something like we have here, Santa Sabina in Rome, and how that's being developed. We still have that same influence. We're looking down the nave right here, the aisles on the side, the altar's right there in the center. And over time, pieces get added as more money comes in. The art, as buildings, of course, are being built, they're going to want highly decorative surfaces as money's coming in, because it also is saying it's a little bit of propaganda. It's saying here's our stories, because you may be illiterate, and that's always a fact. So we're going to put them in picture form. We're also going to show you that we have a little bit of might and power. Our God is greater. We're going to see that happen a lot um, within when these religions come into conflict with one another. They're sort of like, oh well, ours is better, and look at how big of our buildings are, right? God must be on our side because of the beauty that we can do. So all this is coming around, and so images and mosaics become the earliest and some of the best form, next to fresco paintings, on decorating these surfaces, and they start to cover the area. And it's so when you walk in, these places are very, very beautiful. We'll see the height of it when we get to Byzantine art. But to give you an example of a mausoleum, this is a tomb, all right, and usually these are either on the side or even sometimes beneath the church. And so we have important figures. Sometimes it's leaders, sometimes it's a patron that are buried here. But you can see sort of this beautiful tile work where we have, usually it's Jesus, and then the patron next to them. So they're saying, oh yeah, I'm communing with Jesus, and so I'm in the afterlife with him and such. And so, all right. Other forms, we do see ivory carving. Ivory carving is, a medium that's lasted. We've talked about it since Paleolithic, but here we see a narrative come about where we have Judas hanging himself, and there's 30 pieces of silver. We have the crucifixion that's taken place. All these images that are being created are now not about the individual. We're not seeing self-portraiture at this time. We are seeing biblical narratives and storytelling about the Christian faith. Now, Byzantine art, Constantinople's moved the capital, or Constantine has moved to Constantinople, the capital, which was Byzantium, and that's where we get the term Byzantine art. So Byzantine art it definitely develops its own style. When we look at this, we know of it as here's Jesus, the paint creator, and these are usually up in the dome and the main parts, like kind of like looking out at everyone. But there's an elongation to the figure. There's sort of an animation that's going on, but we think of them for the gold tiles that are happening. And this actually is gold leaf tiles that are up in there and covered with sometimes even clear tile to preserve it even more. But that's where we're getting this vivid color and just beautiful gilt work. There's a film on Canopy that I want you to check out called The Byzantine Empire. It's really amazing because they definitely become their own and not just Roman. So it's it's influenced by Romans. But if you've ever been to Istanbul, and I highly recommend, it's a beautiful place, you'll find that it really just has its own sort of culture to what the Romans had already been doing. And so they really developed their own style, and that style does not spread throughout the Roman Empire. It stays there and gets a little bit into Venice. Venice is the other sort of like Byzantine area. But other than that, everything else sticks stylistically Roman, very much Greek. But this is the true separation from what the Greeks would have ever done. So the early Byzantine, we had Emperor Justinian, and he's the one who's going to really put a lot of time and money into building up the city, getting the churches. And for that, I also want you to check out the Hagia Sophia film. We're going to talk about it here in just a sec, but make sure you watch that film. It's an incredible building built by Emperor Justinian. And we would know more about what Justinian did if it wasn't for the iconoclasm movement. Now, iconoclasm happens in almost every religion, actually. and is a pushback to what they believe images should be. So iconoclasm is a destroying of images. It's usually sometimes known as iconophiles, people who love images, versus um, uh, um, uh, the others who hate images. And so in this case, we had Christians destroying Christian artwork because they believe it was breaking one of the commandments of God, do not make any graven images and such. So some believe that they should be making stuff, and some believe they didn't. And there was a time where it was okay to destroy these images. It was kind of hearkened to do. So we would know more if those images actually survived. But one of these really interesting things, it's also gone through a couple stages of iconoclasm, is the Hagia Sophia in the heart of Istanbul. And the Hagia Sophia originally is going to be this structure here. You're going to say, well, it looks like a mosque. Yes. It was originally built as a Christian church by Emperor Justinian, and it's amazing because where the Pantheon was a dome on a circular building, this is a dome on a square. So we already see these areas out here that seem may make it impossible. How can you have that much stone sitting on top of a roof, right? It would just collapse it. So it's a real marvel how this whole thing is held together over time. When eventually this area falls to the Arabs bringing in Islam, it is then converted into a mosque, and then later kind of goes back and forth a little bit, but ends up as now just a cultural center. So if you go there today, it is not a church. And it's a very beautiful, interesting place to see. And you can go inside and you can still see layers. So we have layers of when it was converted into a mosque, right? And we have the calligraphy, usually is the name of Allah or verses from the Quran done very beautifully. And then elsewhere we have, sometimes it's plastered over, but what has come back, you can still see some of that gilding of the mosaics. It's one of those that is not a site that is allowed to be excavated anymore, but if they did, they would find even more underneath the walls. But each layer is sort of very special to each religion, so therefore they just leave what's there. But if you walk around, you'll see areas of the wall that have been removed. Either the plaster has fallen off for natural reasons, or maybe there was some that had been scraped away during another restoration project decades before. Rules were set into place, but there's both Christian and Islamic symbols and images throughout the whole thing. It's a really interesting place. But watch that film; it'll give you more. This is just a slide on comparison on why this style was so different. It will become influential really to the Byzantine style and later form ideas on what a mosque should be when we think of the domes. And so we're going to see this again. So the Hagia Sophia plays a really important part, but it definitely did not follow the Roman basilica footprint. And so therefore it was kind of open for interpretation, and we see it sort of copied again stylistically for Islamic pieces. Now monasteries, these were also built, not to focus on too much, but this is the oldest monastery, and still has some of the oldest texts ever written housed there in its library. It's really amazing. But I just kind of wanted to throw that in there, that this is also going on within all these religious buildings being built. I already talked a little bit about iconoclasm, and so this is a period when Rome was under attack, and they thought, oh, maybe we've done something wrong. We need to please God again, so maybe it's these images. Maybe we should get rid of them, and maybe we'll be forgiven, and everybody will go away, and we'll be back to being the powerful Rome that we know. And so we had the iconophiles and then the iconoclasts, right? Those who loved and those who hated images, and there was sort of this pushback back and forth. But there was a lot of infighting, violence. People were killed, even Christians killing Christians, sort of thing, because of these beliefs. And Islam will also be kind of play into this because they themselves do not believe that there should be any images. So when I traveled throughout Turkey, you would find in these old caves, really, that were churches at times, you would see these paintings on the ceilings and walls, and all the faces would be scratched out. And that would be due to this iconoclasm belief, right? That we should not be seeing anybody's face because there's no human depiction in Islamic work, and it focuses on floral, sometimes animals, usually just floral patterns, and this idea of like Eden. We'll talk about that in a sec. So we do get Islamic movements in this time period that are also removing those Christian symbols and usually just painting over or plastering over them, like we see in the Hagia Sophia. Middle Byzantine area. This period is marked by the action against iconoclasm. The law would change and make it now illegal to destroy those images. So now it's okay to come back with them. And when we see sort of a revival of them, during this time, what's really interesting is because there's been such a sharing of ideas between cultures, is now look at how we're actually seeing depth being used. And early depictions that I had, like of Jesus, I'll jump right back here, right? That's very flat and forward looking. Even when you try to think of the dimension of this Bible, it doesn't really seem right. But now we're seeing even more perspective being used, which means that the compositions can open up even more. So that's what's really interesting is now, as we're now remaking the images that they just made, there's a little bit more focus on what these spaces can imply, these shapes can do for us. Late Byzantine art. This is really marked by the end of how the Turks conquered Anatolia, which is now all in Turkey. And we see a split in the Church of Rome and Church of Orthodox, and these crusades would start. So, it'd just be sort of a turmoil of a time, but art did continue through this, and we see some murals that are created and also signs. So we're seeing still some documentation that are coming through. Here's an idea of those murals. We have in the top right and in the bottom, we see the Church of Kora, which is also in Istanbul. It's actually much more beautiful and gilded than like Hagia Sophia and stuff, but it is a lot smaller. It's interesting because the church was actually built by a guy who he had a lot of money. He was an emperor, or a major leader, and he had a lot of money and was very selfish. And he took this money and he built this church and it gilded it up. And then he was overthrown, and he ends up being sort of like a peasant monk sort of person that had, claimed sanctuary in the church, and then eventually even dies there, right? And that's where he had to stay. So it's kind of interesting that he didn't even know, but he was sort of building his own sort of prison in many regards with all his money. But in there, we see a lot of examples of murals. These are frescoes on the wall. These are in the back part of the church. The main sanctuary is still covered in that very traditional Byzantine gilded tesserae style. But this is just plain fresco on the wall. And then we also see what's called the iconostasis, which is this wooden wall that would have been placed between the altar and the nave, which is kind of like a barrier to say, this is if you walk through here, this is the more holy part, and usually only very wealthy patrons were able to get inside there. So it's kind of this barrier, but on the outside were usually images, not only the saints, but sometimes they'd even have the scenes going on, so you could walk up to it and sort of get the message if you weren't there, or if you didn't understand the language or couldn't read. Now, Islamic art, it's going to differ in many ways. As we know, Muhammad founded Islam. He was actually a businessman, a trader, and he, had a vision, but people didn't really agree with that, and he was actually driven out of his home in Mecca, and he goes to Medina, and in Medina he sort of finds sanctuary, finds followers, and then returns to Mecca in 10 years with his army and takes over. And that's sort of the beginning of this entire movement. And it's really amazing because it grows so rapidly through there, and it really unifies the Arabic speaking world and the Middle East, and kind of puts sort of a standard in place that hadn't been in for a long time. And so with this, there's just massive growth, and we're going to see an explosion within mathematics and astronomy. A lot of things that happen academically within Islam would then be shared during, whether forcefully or given, during the Crusades. And so this is where a collaboration of thoughts, or where people are taking books and then bringing them back, and they're kind of learning from one another in many regards, even though they're trying to kill each other. So, but what we see in art is a very elaborate geometric patterns and calligraphy. There's a film called The Hidden Art of Islam, and that's on your Canopy list, and it talks about why and what you're looking at within Islamic art. It's a bit long, and it's very even more of a contemporary look, but it's pretty interesting on the belief of image making. Now, early Islamic art, a lot of it's done within the architecture, similar to how the Christians, when buildings are being erected, then they need to be decorated. So some of the earliest forms that we see are these, but they always go back to sort of this just beautiful ornamentation. So I want you to take a look at these pieces, and to really sort of understand, or this one specifically, the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem, of like why it's so important. This was supposedly built where Solomon's temple was, and Adam, his grave is, and Abraham's site. So I mean, it's a very specific site, and that's where a lot of these first buildings were erected. Now the mosque itself, it needed to sort of find its format. The terms that are there, you'll need to know. The first three deal with the mosque itself. The last being the Quran, as we know, is the holy text for Islam. And what happens is that this is actually based off of Muhammad's home. And so when he is in Medina, the way the structure was, they had the home here, much smaller than in the scale of what we have as for the mosque. But then there would be palm trees that were sort of lined around for shade, and there's sort of a courtyard area, and this is where people would come and listen to him preach. So the mosque takes on that same architecture, and so we have the this long wall here is known the Qibla, and it's always it will always house the mihrab, right? Which is, it's sort of this indentation space that some would say was where Muhammad would have stood to preach, and others say it's just the way that points to Mecca. That's always going to be the wall that we know that points to Mecca. A minaret is a tower. Sometimes we, here in this great mosque of the Caravan, we see it as one. We know them stylistically, like in the Hagia Sophia, as having four. And really, these were originally, early in their religion, because of the persecution they faced, and also just because of time, were watchtowers. And so that's what they originally were, but now they have been evolved into where the crier would go and shout out the prayer that would be 5 times a day. And so they crawl, be able to get up at a high distance and speak out. So that's where these models come from, and they'll continue to evolve, this being one of the earliest and more traditional in those styles. But we see other styles, right? Here's that same Great Mosque Caravan here, but then we also see this one in Mali, which is in Western Africa. And we see it built in mud and stick. And what they would do is just use the mud in mud brick form. These not only create roof structures on the inside and some supports, but they also become the scaffolding when they need to recoat this. And then something like this, where we have the minaret tower, being this spiral, almost like a Tower of Babel sort of thing. So there there is a lot of flexibility, and this is where culturally it comes into play, and that's why Islam was very popular across many continents and spread so quickly. Is that it adapted to many forms and to the materials at hand. Now, the art we've talked about already briefly. Islamic calligraphy is seen as the highest form of art. The calligraphy itself is usually passages from the Quran. And so, if you are writing the word of God, what can be more beautiful than that? Sort of the reason behind it. But you will find it, uh, this calligraphy done in numerous ways that sometimes even resemble like animals. They use that to sort of not only create an image with, but also still to contain that text. So once again, that's the highest form, and it's done in a lot of beautiful ways. You got a lot of a manuscript illumination that's going on with it, and that's what this is. A lot of little drawings and such like that we'll see a lot during medieval art. But this stuff did, as it was captured during the Crusades, really did sort of inspire bookmakers, bookbinders, and stuff back in Europe. Textiles. Textiles were actually brought in from all over the place as they expanded, but they were used to cover walls, floors, things like that. You think of in areas that were still nomadic, textiles, rugs and stuff were highly used to just sort of cover the bare ground, so that way you had more of a sense of home in it. This is it shows sort of the breadth of the of at least the trade that was going on, because here we see things coming in from China, like the silk and the silk textiles. So we know that there's a broad reach. One that doesn't get covered a whole lot, but is still amazing, is the metalwork. And their metalwork was so sought after because they can use a combination of metals. They really knew metallurgy very well. They had the technology to shape, to form, to cast it, to engrave it. And so we have something like this animal here that's just elaborated with engravings to show not only text, but what a naturalistic and then symbolic sort of features around it. It's quite ornate and beautiful. But it was so highly sought after, actually, that we have pieces from that were made during the Crusades that are that Christians would have had commissioned by local workers in let's say Turkey and in the Middle Eastern areas, that are full of Islamic writing and imagery and stuff, and have come back to then decorate Christian churches. So it's very interesting during that time, the sort of overlap that's happening. Now, later in Islamic art, we see really high, because Islam spreads from the Middle East, gets all the way up to Turkey, but then swoops around North Africa and ends up in Spain. So Spain is really the stopping point. And in fact, if it wasn't for the battle there, the French stopping, then probably Islam would have taken Europe. It would have had two fronts and probably been able to take over Europe. But it doesn't. It was stopped in Spain. And in Spain, we see amazing work. And these are called muqarnas. And you can't tell so much, maybe a little bit from here, but they almost look like the stalagmites in a cave, right, that hang from the ceiling. And this is a right underneath view of it. Quite beautiful. And they've always made these little niches, but now we're having what looks to be like these geometric forms almost coming down. So just gorgeous in their making. And I highly recommend just taking a view. There's probably a virtual tour of this in Cordoba in Spain. The architecture, other buildings known as madrasa, these mimicked mosques. So if we looked at this, you say, oh, that's a mosque, but they're not. These are universities. And so universities are popping up, which of course lets you know just how much knowledge is being spread. The Ottoman Empire is very late, and this is very much in Turkey. And this is where they take that central dome plan of the Hagia Sophia and use it again and again to make their mosques off these. So we see that Hagia Sophia inspire these domes, because this is not the Hagia Sophia. And it's really beautiful because then we get dome after dome after dome coming off of these places here. And we see sort of, in fact, sometimes when I look at this, it reminds me a little bit like the Disneyland, Disney World Castle, right? This sort of spiring stuff, because it just seems so perfect and beautiful in ways. And I know this is kind of a weird comparison, but that's kind of what I feel like is this is sort of the height of Islamic architecture. Ceramic tiles are very big and being used. That the tiles and the ornation we have here, what's sometimes known as Giri tiles. This is where they're able to use just 5 shapes to create an elaborate network of patterns. And this is that little niche that we would have seen on the Qibla wall, right? How beautiful and ornate it is. But everything here is floral designed and calligraphy. You will not find images of human beings. In the film, they'll talk a little bit about that split, why some Islamic people don't mind making images of people. And sometimes it's because it was kind of slid under the radar because it was stylized, and the way they did it it almost looked like it was animated, like it wasn't real. And it also wasn't showing an actual portrait of the individual. So there's a few rules break, but not, most of the stuff that you're going to see in Islamic art is going to look like this. Here's some more examples of the metalwork that I was talking about. And this is that example where we have artwork made by Islamic individuals, but commissioned by Christians. And so these are in Christian churches, but are made, especially when you look at this, is very Islamic in its design. And they're the ones who made this. So it's very interesting to me, the combination of religions there. So that's the quickest way I can go about this chapter. There's a lot to cover. If you have any questions about it or want to know more details, please just send me an email.